and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Thursday, the 2nd of June. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 99 of the illegal Russian war of aggression. Then I'll introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will take a look at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has claimed that 243 children have been killed so far in the war, and 200,000 children have been forcefully taken to Russia, including children from orphanages, children taken with their parents, and those separated from their families. Speaking in relation to children taken to Russia, he said, "The purpose of this criminal policy is not just to steal people, but to make those who are deported forget about Ukraine and unable to return." In her first public speech since leaving office about 6 months ago, Angela Merkel has described Russia's war on Ukraine as a barbaric war of aggression, which amounted to a far-reaching turning point. She said that whilst she was reluctant to give her views from the sidelines as a former German Chancellor, she could not avoid talking about the most glaring breach of international law in the history of Europe since the end of the Second World War. The headquarters of the Territorial Defence of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic claims to have 222 settlements under their control. They claim overnight 10 areas of Donetsk were shelled by Ukrainian forces and that one person was killed and 19 more were injured. A foreign ministry spokesman, Oleg Nikolenko, has said that Ukraine is working with international partners to create a United Nations-backed mission to restore Black Sea shipping routes and export of Ukrainian farm produce. Slovakia will deliver 8 self-propelled Zuzana II howitzers to Ukraine under a commercial contract with which a state-controlled producer has signed, the Slovak Defence Ministry has said. Ukraine's victory over Scotland in their FIFA World Cup playoff semi-final last night gave the country, in the words of President Zelensky, 2 hours of happiness to which we are not accustomed. A Russian missile hit rail lines in the western Lviv region, a key conduit for supplies of Western weapons and other supplies, officials have said. The Lviv regional governor, Maxim Kozitsky, said 5 people were wounded in the strike. Anton Gerashenko, an advisor to the country's interior minister, said the Russians hit the Beskidi railway tunnel in the Carpathian Mountains in an apparent effort to cut a key rail link and disrupt shipments of weapons and fuel. Denmark has voted overwhelmingly to join the EU's common defence policy, becoming the last of the bloc's members to sign up. The referendum on Wednesday, in which voters backed the government's proposal by 66.9% to 33.1%, followed historic applications by Denmark's previously non-aligned Nordic neighbours, Finland and Sweden, to join NATO last month. And NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said he will convene a meeting in Brussels in the coming days with senior officials from Sweden, Finland and Turkey to discuss Turkey's opposition to Sweden and Finland joining the alliance. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said there was a strong consensus within NATO, broadly, to support the rapid accession of Sweden and Finland to NATO, and he was confident it would happen. Now, we are very lucky this evening to be joined by Roger Mullin, who is, of course, a former SNP MP and former chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Explosive Weapons. Roger has over 30 years' experience in leading research and consultancy companies. He's an honorary professor at the University of Stirling Management School, and before entering Parliament, he undertook 27 international assignments for UN agencies, the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. Since leaving Parliament in 2017, he's a special envoy for the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Explosive Threats, and he's the founding director of Momentous Change Limited. Roger, good evening. How are you keeping?
Good evening, Andrew. I'm grand and all the better for seeing you, of course.
Well, thank you for joining us this evening on Scotland at 7, Roger. Now, you were telling me before we came on air that you've been invited to attend a UN conference in Geneva to discuss humanitarian needs in Ukraine. What do you think are the immediate humanitarian priorities there?
Well, You mentioned one in your early remarks, Andrew, and that is looking at the case of children. We know that there are tens of thousands of children who have been traumatized by the war. We know, for example, as I think you indicated, that some of them have been targeted by Russia, but even those that are living or that have moved outside Ukraine are suffering very wide range of needs that currently are not being met. So one of the things I'm going to be talking about are the wide range of circumstances that children are facing because of the situation in Ukraine and what the international community needs to do to address them. There's been far too little focus on humanitarian needs, and particularly the humanitarian needs of children.
Thanks, Roger. That's a great insight, and very best of luck for the conference and for making
Thank you.
headway in discussing, as you say, children's needs and humanitarian priorities more generally. We'll move to our first story for this evening, though, because people needing urgent and unplanned hospital care will benefit from a new national improvement programme aimed at reducing waiting times. The Urgent and Unscheduled Care Collaborative will see health boards adopt a number of measures to reduce A&E waiting times and improve patient experience, including offering alternatives to hospital-based treatment. People will also be offered scheduled urgent appointments to avoid long waits in A&E. The programme will also determine how the discharge process can be simplified to ensure patients don't face unnecessary delays in leaving hospital. Health boards will share more than £50 million of funding this year to support this national integrated approach, with the work already underway in some areas. Earlier this week, the Scottish Government's Resource Spending Review was published, setting out priorities for the next 5 years, including investment and reform of health and social care services. The Health Secretary, Hamza Yousaf, said, "It is absolutely crucial we ensure people are receiving the right care at the right time and in the right place. That's why I'm pleased to confirm today's £50 million investment to help achieve our national urgent and unscheduled care priorities." So, Roger, it struck me that this story is as much about reshaping services rather than increasing services, and also reshaping that seems to me to be being driven by clinicians rather than politicians. So, in general, do you think is this the right way to go about improving and reforming critical care in Scotland?
Well, it's actually something that I've been hoping that would happen for a long time. One of the things that we need to recognize in the modern world is that there are different ways in which people access different types of services, and the health needs of the nation are no different in that regard. So, to me, what is particularly useful is this opens up different avenues for accessing social care and health care, and that can only be a positive thing. I am also very pleased to see an effort is being made to give further support for discharging from hospitals. This has been a long-standing issue, and it's really good to see a focus on that as well.
Now, that's an interesting point that you make, Roger, because this latest announcement, I think it indicates that it will rely on collaboration by different parts of SNHS and also local authorities, if, for example,
Absolutely.
discharge processes are going to improve. So, in a system where money is tight, and it's always tight, but in a system like that, what do you think are the prospects for the collaboration that's going to be necessary?
Well, I think from my contacts around the community is that there's a lot of commitment to this. I think a lot of people have recognized that for far too long, things haven't been as joined up as they could be. And anything that is going to enable things to be more joined up at the end of the day will serve the patient, will serve the community best. So I think the will is there to make it work. I think the professionals want it to work. And I think such collaborations as has been going on related to health in recent years have generally been very positively received. So I would be quite hopeful that this is going to be another useful initiative on the part of the Scottish Government.
Thanks, Roger. As you say, another useful initiative from the Scottish Government in this area. Let's move to our next story for this evening, though, because a Tory MP and arch critic of Boris Johnson has sparked a backlash from Brexiteers after suggesting that Britain rejoin the EU's single market to help ease the cost of living crisis. Tobias Ellwood's comments were seized upon by allies of the Prime Minister as evidence that deposing Johnson now would threaten the country's more distant relationship with Brussels. In a call for more radical thinking to energise our economy through these stormy waters, Ellwood said that the government should better maximise our Brexit fortunes. Drawing on his 6 years serving in the army, Ellwood wrote an article for the House Parliamentary magazine that if an army general mid-battle is mature enough to finesse his strategy to secure mission success, then government should do the same, adding that there was vast room for improvement in economic relations with the EU. He argued that exports to Europe had shrunk by £20 billion, with fishers and farmers facing particular hardship, and the issue of the Northern Ireland Protocol remained unresolved. All of these challenges would disappear if we dare to advance our Brexit model by rejoining the EU single market, he wrote. His argument, however, was used by Johnson's allies to suggest the attempt to force a confidence vote next week was evidence of anti-Brexit bias. David Frost, the UK's chief negotiator during the divorce talks, said that Ellwood's intervention shows Brexit really is not safe in his hands or his allies. Some of those seeking to oust Johnson hastily distanced themselves from Ellwood's comments, fearful they would be seized upon by Number 10. Mark Harper, a senior Conservative MP who has submitted a no-confidence letter in Johnson, said he categorically disagreed with Ellwood and was clear that Brexit meant leaving the single market and putting an end to freedom of movement, the end. So, Roger, firstly, just in passing, it was interesting to learn that both Tobias Martin Ellwood and Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson were born in New York, less than a year apart. But we'll need to analyse that a bit more carefully. But the question I was going to ask you is, so what do you think is going on here? To shore up crumbling support for Johnson in his own party, is every opponent of Johnson going to be branded an anti-Brexiteer, and so some sort of goyim, some not a believer in the one true path?
Well, I certainly think that what they're going to do is use Brexit and a hard Brexit and surround Johnson in that as a means of defending himself against critics within the Tory party. I would have to say Tobias Ellwood is one of the more free-thinking Tories and is very likely to, in that regard, keep on speaking. I don't think he's likely to garner very much support from within the Tories. But I mean, I welcome what he's saying. I mean, anything that can end up putting David Frost, Michael Gove and the likes into a right lather can only be good and show that there is some substance to his argument. But I think what you're hinting at, Andrew, is absolutely correct, that Boris Johnson's campaign to try and save himself is going to be fought around Brexit is safe in my hands and in no one else's, which is another good reason, in my view, for getting rid of Boris Johnson.
Absolutely, Roger. Now, the backbench MP Stella Creasy, who's chair of Labour Movement for Europe, praised Mr Ellwood for speaking out, and she said, for the sake of jobs, peace and equality, UK must discuss our future with Europe. And it struck me, is that one of the roots of the problem at the moment? Ardent Brexiteers are so blinkered and so focused that they are absolutely unable to operate in a diplomatic manner, and as a result there is no discussion with Europe. All we get is a beetroot-faced David Frost shouting across the English Channel from the pages of the Telegraph and the Express.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think there is a word that cannot be applied to Brexit and Brexiteers, and that is strategy. They don't actually have a strategy. What they've got is an ideological commitment, and nothing is going to get in the way of that. They don't have any means of finessing a situation. They don't have diplomacy skills to negotiate effectively, David Frost being an absolutely classic of the type, goes into negotiations unprepared, unable to negotiate effectively, But that is a function of what they were fighting the campaign on. They were seeing the big win just in having a Brexit, not in actually doing anything to try and improve the situation for the people in the country. It was purely ideologically driven.
Absolutely, Roger. Thank you. I was also struck that the Treasury Minister, Simon Clarke, now you might remember Mr. Clarke, who Downing Street so spectacularly threw under the bus a weekend or two ago in connection with Partygate, when he said that Sue Gray had instigated the meeting with Johnson and then Downing Street contradicted him. But Mr. Clarke said that he was pleased to reassure Tobias Ellwood that Britain would not be rejoining the single market. And Mr. Clarke claimed that the move would, that rejoining the single market would extinguish half the freedoms that make Brexit so important. So you were telling me that you cannot deduce or divine any strategy amongst Brexiteers. Can you deduce or identify any of the freedoms that Simon Clarke says exist as a result of Brexit?
No, I mean, in my view, we've actually got less freedom. We've got less freedom because we no longer have the power to effectively negotiate in the international community. We have less influence in terms of international negotiations. We are more in a straitjacket. Look at the mess that has been created over the Northern Ireland Protocol. That's not an indication of increased freedom. That's an indication of increased impoverishedness of thinking and of strategy and of tactics. So it strikes me a nonsense what they're saying, but we are well used to hearing nonsense from the Brexiteers, aren't we?
Well, it's been several years that we've been enduring that process. You're absolutely right. James Withers, who's currently the head of Scotland Food and Drink, said that Tobias Ellwood's intervention was a timely, welcome reminder from that Brexit is doable without shooting ourselves in both feet. Uh, in that way, why do you think that if James Withers is correct, why were Brexiteers so keen to shoot themselves in both feet first?
They've got this purist view of what Brexit means to them. And what it means to them is simply a complete withdrawal from the European Union and all the powerful bodies that were set up and the strategies of the European Union. So they just want to exit from everything. That is why I've called it merely ideological rather than any thoughtful approach to exiting the European Union. I mean, the problem they've got now is even if you were to agree with Tobias Ellwood, even if Tobias Ellwood was trying, it would be very difficult for the UK to find an easy ear to get back into the single market as things stand at the moment with relationships in other dimensions of the relationship between the UK and the EU. So it's a difficult one, but it's one where it's the purity of ideological thought on part of the Brexiteers that is what is most concerning to people like myself, and I'm sure to the people in Scotland, whether it's James Withers, the business community, or just the average person in the street. I mean, our future certainly is as an independent European country within Europe.
Absolutely, Roger. Thank you. And in terms of that purity of thought, even if Boris Johnson is brought down by his by the industrial scale of the law breaking that seems to have gone on in Downing Street under his charge, even if he is brought down, I think it's the I've not checked the vote the odds in the last 2 or 3 days, but a leading candidate to replace him, of course, is Liz Truss. Do you think that she would continue this singularity and of ideology? And if that's so, what do you think the prospects are, or what kind of timescale do you think there is round about the UK beginning to re-establish some sort of sensible diplomatic relationship with Europe?
Well, I think if it's Liz Truss or some of the other people I've heard who may run for the office, their problem is they're already starting to make a play and say, look at me, you can trust Brexit with me. So the problem is Liz Truss, if she was to become successful, there is no sign she'll do anything other than surround herself with the Michael Goves of this world. So I don't see that it's going to lead to any great difference in that regard in terms of content. And the one thing that is very clear is that some of those who want rid of Johnson are not wanting to get rid of him because of Brexit. They're wanting to get rid of him because of the question around his law breaking and partying and the like. But I can see no way in which the Tories are going to elect a leader who is anything other than in the Johnson mould in terms of Brexit. But they'll hope that the other characteristics they can get rid of.
Well, we shall see. We shall see, Roger. It's going to be an interesting week, I think, once MPs return to Westminster after this weekend. But let's move to our next story now, because a powerful standards watchdog has accused Boris Johnson of failing to allay fears that he and his ministers consider themselves above the rules, as his support continues to ebb away in the wake of the Partygate scandal. Jonathan Evans, the chair of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, criticised a planned overhaul to the way the ministerial code is policed, saying they undermined the role of Boris Johnson's ethics advisor, Christopher Geidt. Downing Street announced the changes last week after Evans' committee made a string of proposals earlier this year. The changes slated by the government include allowing ministers to escape resignation for minor infractions, but not giving Geidt the power to launch his own investigations without the Prime Minister's prior permission, as the Committee on Standards had urged. Evans, who's a former head of MI5, said it was highly unsatisfactory that Johnson had only accepted part of the package of reforms, and the plans as they stood would not restore public trust. Geidt came close to resigning on Tuesday over Johnson's failure to explain why he believed he had not broken the ministerial code when he received the fixed penalty notice. A cabinet source insisted on Wednesday that Geidt was definitely not resigning. Even before the Partygate scandal, Johnson's government had been accused of undermining standards in public life, including by overruling the finding of Geidt's predecessor, Alex Allen, that the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, had bullied staff, albeit inadvertently. Allen resigned in protest. Johnson still faces an investigation by the House of Commons Privileges Committee over whether he lied to MPs when repeatedly asserting that all guidance was followed in Downing Street. Despite the changes to the ministerial code that have been proposed, the penalty for misleading Parliament remains resignation. So, Roger, firstly, is it really news anymore that Boris Johnson has failed to do something which every other politician would automatically do? Is that the point in Johnson? The rules just don't apply to him and those who fund him, either in terms of the criminal law or in terms of the received laws of how politics is done.
That's right. In terms of ethics, he is probably the best example that I can think of politically of somebody who breaks every rule of ethics in the book. I mean, basically, there are two broad ways in which people who write about ethics talk. One is where they say, did you follow rules that were established to make sure that people were behaving appropriately? And it's perfectly obvious that Boris Johnson was not only breaking the rules, but he was doing so knowingly, and that he told lies about it to Parliament. So we know that he's a rule breaker. More importantly, in some senses for me, another way of looking at ethics is in terms of consequences. What are the consequences of the behaviour? Well, in my view, the consequences of Boris Johnson's behaviour is to undermine the prospect if an emergency, a public emergency was to occur again, that the people would be inclined themselves to follow the rules. Because if they think we've got a system where those in number 10, the Prime Minister, people at the top can break the rules willy-nilly and get away with it, why in the future would anybody want to follow any rules? So in terms of the impact and the outcome, I think his behaviour is breaking every ethical good practice in the book. But he's not interested in ethics, is he? I mean, what he believes is that the world is as according to Boris Johnson, and that whatever he believes is what reality is. And that is not the world anyone else lives in.
Yeah, and it's quite a worrying world that you're describing there, Roger. Interestingly, we will come back to the public reaction to lawbreaking in Downing Street when we talk about a later story in the programme this evening. So we'll tease that point a little bit more just for the moment. But I was going to, in terms of what you were just saying, Roger, is any or are every ethics advisors bound to fail with Johnson? Because Johnson fundamentally does not understand or respect any ethics at all.
Yeah, I can't think of anybody who could take on that job that would have any realistic chance of changing Boris Johnson's behaviour or beliefs. Uh, this is how he has lived his life. He has lived his life lying and getting sacked in quite a number of jobs, as we know. Uh, this is part of who he is. It is not some peculiarity. It's not by happen chance that it's just happened recently. And so the notion that he is going to change his behavior, after all, if you think about it in terms of what's going on in his head, he will be saying, well, all this behavior people are criticizing me about has allowed me to become prime minister. Why should I change now? And so that in his odd view of the world, I don't think he takes seriously at all any ethical criticisms of himself. And therefore, he has got absolutely no incentive in his own mind to change his behaviour.
That's an interesting point that you make, Roger. It's apparent that in voting, given his record and given his track record of his behaviour, I think it's fair to say that Tory voters and Tory politicians had already baked in, had accepted that Johnson would behave as Johnson has always behaved, and that this was part of this was part of the package, and so it shouldn't come as a surprise that we now find ourselves in a situation where the law clearly has been broken on such a regular scale. Do you think it's also been suggested this week that one of the reasons that the current cabinet are displaying such loyalty to Johnson is that they know that there is no chance that any other prime minister would ever put them in a cabinet. They are all only there because they signed an oath of loyalty to Johnson in terms of Brexit. So, do you think does that if that is true, do you think that there's much prospect of the cabinet beginning to coalesce around a move to replace Johnson, or do you think is there any prospect of the wider Conservative Party beginning to recognise that change needs to happen?
I don't fully agree with that type of analysis because, in relation to what I said earlier about Liz Truss, I think what will happen is the cabinet will start moving around an alternative to make sure that their preferences, politics, Brexit wise, and the like are secure with whoever takes over. And I think to win an election, the Liz Trusses of this world are going to have the support of a lot of the existing cabinet. How does a politician get support of somebody? Well, a good way is to offer them a job. So I think it's more the other way around. I think any new leader may well be captured by the cabinet rather than having the freedom to get rid of the cabinet.
That's a very interesting analysis, and I can completely see the point you're making there, Roger. There was one other thing I was going to ask you, hypothetically at least. Who do you think said this week, "I'm left feeling angry and disappointed. It beggars belief that a rotten core with an unacceptable culture carried on, regardless of the restrictions placed on the rest of us." Now, I don't expect to know who that was. It was Simon Fell, who's the Tory MP for Barrow, which is, of course, a redder than red wall seat, which he won in 2019. So, in
I
terms
was
of
just going
Tory
to say, is
politics,
that Simon Fell from Barrow that said that?
well, there we go. So, in reality, in thinking about politicians and Tory voters, do you in saying that the culture was unacceptable, is Fell expressing more anxiety about the industrial quantities of law breaking in Downing Street, Or is he more anxious about how his constituents are reacting to that law breaking?
Yes, well, I don't actually know him enough to make a judgment about what his own particular motivation is in saying that. But I do think what it does is it raises an interesting question about the types of Conservatives that have managed to get into Parliament in recent years and have managed to get into the Cabinet in recent years. I mean, with the best will in the world, although I've never been a Tory or a Conservative in all my life, I think it'd be fair to say if you look back at the type of Conservative MPs that existed in the 60s, even though I would disagree with almost all of their policies, nonetheless, what they prided themselves in a kind of decency and loyalty, albeit in their own terms. And so that I think many of those would find it astonishing as to where the Tory party have ended up with the type of people that are leading it and their type of view. I mean, it used to be people thought of more than any other party. This was the party of law and order. Now, more than any other party, it is the party of law breaking.
Completely, Roger, and certainly the point that you make there is absolutely right, and I think we'll watch with interest as this week unfolds in Westminster, with the potential for more MPs, more Tory MPs handing in their notices, their letters to the 1922 committee, and as you say, the ongoing disappearance of what some people call the good chat principle, which up
Yeah.
until this Tory government or recent Tory governments was a fairly fundamental part of the UK constitution, but now seems to have been abandoned. But let's move on to our next story, because the UN Refugee Agency has said that a clear majority of people arriving in the UK by small boats across the Channel should be considered to be refugees, in a challenge to the Home Secretary, Priti Patel. Ms Patel told MPs and peers last year that 70% of people making the crossing were single men who are effectively economic migrants, and that the government has repeatedly referred to them as migrants. Asked to justify Patel's figures at the time, a Home Office source said that of the 8,500 people arriving by small boat in 2020, 87% were men and 74% were aged between 18 and 39. But the source did not provide any evidence related to their asylum claims. Home Office staff are this week sending out the first formal removal letters to people who have arrived in small boats, warning them that they will be sent 4,000 miles away to Rwanda. The first plane is supposed to leave the UK for the East African state in 2 weeks' time. The policy is explicitly focused on people who arrive via small boats across the Channel or hidden in lorries. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has said that those travelling by small boat to the UK should be considered to be asylum seekers or refugees and not migrants. The UNHCR said that the UK government's own data challenged claims that most people travelling to the UK by small boat are economic migrants. They said, based on currently available Home Office data, the UNHCR considers that a clear majority of those recently arriving to the UK by boat are likely to be refugees. Refugees and asylum seekers are not and should not be described as migrants, the spokesperson said. Access to asylum should never be contingent on mode of arrival or nationality. Equally, the only way to establish whether people are refugees is through a fair and efficient determination of their claims, for which the UK has a clear responsibility. A new analysis of the government's latest data shows that 77% of the men, women, and children who come across the Channel in small boats are likely to be refugees and would accordingly be allowed to remain in the UK if their claims were assessed. That figure, or the grant rate, is calculated using recent government data showing small boat arrivals for the top 20 countries of origin between January 2021 and March 2022. So, Roger, the UNHCR said that the government's data challenged claims that most people travelling to the UK by small boat were economic migrants. They said a clear majority of those recently arriving to the UK by boat are likely to be refugees. So, do you think that this mischaracterization, this deliberate pre-mischaracterization of people coming across the channel in small boats, do you think that might be one of the first grounds on which Priti Patel's Rwanda solution will be challenged both in the court of public opinion and in legal courts as well?
Well, yes, I think you're absolutely right. And I think your lead in explanation of the story was very clear and excellent, and something that I would completely agree with. Uh, I don't think Priti Patel's view about migrants is based on any information whatsoever. I think it is based on what she wants to achieve in terms of a political hit within the country, because she believes being seen to be tough on immigration is a vote winner for her and for people like her. And that, I think, is what is driving her. And so she is deliberately mischaracterizing the situation in her own political interests and what she thinks is the Tory party's political interests. It's certainly not based on any humanitarian concern for individuals involved. I mean, what you also described is absolutely correct. We have got, indeed, the UK has got an obligation to properly consider each individual and properly consider the likelihood that they are, in fact, refugees, many of them coming from places where their lives would be at risk, where there is violence and turmoil surrounding their experience, and so they feel that they have to escape. And if we were living in such a society, we would want to escape if we were under the type of threat many of these people feel that they have been living under. I mean, there might be some who are not genuine refugees, but I think it is very likely that the majority are, and that should be and from a humanitarian point of view, that should be the default position. Whereas Priti Patel's default position is precisely the reverse. Her default position is nobody's a genuine refugee, and we'll construct our policies in that light. Quite appalling, really.
It is, and as you say, in terms of that pre-characterization and pre-classification of anybody seeking refuge in the UK as not being a refugee, it's not for reflection here, but it must give an insight into her own thinking, given that her parents were refugees who sought refuge in the UK themselves. But the UNHCR also said that access to asylum should never be contingent on mode of arrival, small boats or lorries, or nationality. And equally, the only way to establish whether people are refugees is through a fair and efficient determination of their claims. And that's something
Yeah,
that the UK is responsible for. So do you think are these aspects of the Rwanda of Priti Patel's Rwanda solution, are these aspects also now going to be debated and discussed both in on the front pages of the right wing press, which operates out of London, but also in the legal courts as the imminent flights are challenged by lawyers?
I certainly think there's likely to be a number of legal challenges to this Rwandan policy, and quite rightly so. I think to try and determine things. The problem I see is one more with, as you describe it, and the court of public opinion, because there's a substantial part of the press are sympathetic towards the view that Priti Patel takes, and that are themselves very right wing, very unconcerned about the humanitarian issues that are involved in this, and unconcerned about the international rights of refugees. So that I'm not terribly optimistic that the court of public opinion in that regard is likely to turn heavily against the government, particularly in parts of England. So that I think the main hope in terms of a challenge is going to reside with the courts. And that, I think, is what we need to have a focus on over the coming months.
That's an interesting point, Roger. And of course, we expect that perhaps lefty lawyers and the defence of people's rights in courts may also become another front in the culture war that the cabinet is fighting in the absence of any actual policies. So we'll look forward to seeing that. I was also going to ask you about one other element of this, if I may, Data shows that 1,094 Afghans arrived by small boat between January and March this year in the 3 months. Of course, that's after the fall of the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban last August. Now, that 1,094 compares with 1,300 Afghans for the whole of 2021. Now, in processing the claims of Afghans who have crossed during 21 and so far in 22, the grant rate is 88%. So even with the current Home Office, with its current approaches to refugees and asylum seekers, they're still granting Afghans claims at a rate of 88%. So in those circumstances, what is the impact going to be of Afghans who arrive in small boats immediately being deported to Rwanda? In the context of what the UK has done and not done in Afghanistan, is this just another insult and affront to Afghans after everything else that's been heaped upon them by the UK governments?
Uh, yes, obviously we've got to wait and see what exactly transpires in terms of who's going to be put in these planes off to Rwanda. But when you consider that the UK government has broken its promise to many of the people who are working for UK bodies within Afghanistan, that they would have a welcome and they would help them to get out and come to the UK in the first place, there are still, my understanding, thousands of people left in Afghanistan that have been abandoned by the UK. And of course, how some of them have got out is not through the UK helping them to get out, it's by becoming this type of refugee, having to cross in small boats. Now, if that is not an affront to the way in which the UK has behaved in relation to Afghanistan, I don't know what is. But I would be as concerned as you've expressed it in terms of what is going to happen in terms of this policy about starting to ship people off to Rwanda.
Thanks, Roger. We'll continue to look at matters Rwandan for a moment with our next story, because Rwanda has been accused of being among the worst perpetrators of transnational repression in the US, stalking, harassing, and threatening exiles there, according to a new report. The report by the Freedom House advocacy group in Washington names Rwanda alongside China, Russia, Iran, and Egypt as the principal offenders in seeking to extend their reach of their repressive regimes into the US. Isabel Lintzer, one of the report's authors, said the findings raise further questions about the UK government's agreement with Kigali to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda. The first deportation flight is due on the 14th of June. She said, people often focus on Saudi Arabia, Iran, China, Russia, but Rwanda is one of the most prolific perpetrators of transnational repression in the world. She said it certainly has not received the same level of scrutiny as some of those other countries. She continued, the asylum deal between the UK and Rwanda is quite shocking, given how frequently the Rwandan government has gone after Rwandans in the UK, and the British government is well aware of that. The Freedom House report, Unsafe in America, Transnational Repression in the United States, notes autocrats cast a long shadow onto America's soil. The governments of Iran, China, Egypt, Russia, Rwanda, Saudi Arabia, and other states are increasingly and more aggressively disregarding US laws to threaten, harass, surveil, stalk, and even plot to physically harm people across the country. One of those targeted was Paul Rusesabagina, the former Kigali hotel manager whose efforts to save people during the 1994 genocide is told in the film Hotel Rwanda. Rusesabagina, now a US permanent resident and a prominent dissident, was abducted while traveling in the Middle East in August 2020, tricked into boarding a private plane that took him to Rwanda, where he was tried and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Last month, the US State Department formally declared him to be wrongfully detained. Rusesabagina's daughter Karine and other Rwandan dissidents have been found to have been the targets of surveillance using Pegasus spyware made by the Israeli security firm NSO Group. The Rwandan government has denied using the spyware, but did not respond to a request to comment from the Freedom House report. So, Roger, firstly, is there perhaps and we're back on ethics again, is there perhaps a broader ethical question here? Would it be reasonable to classify any regime prepared to participate in Priti Patel's horrific plans? Would it be reasonable to classify them as automatically completely unsuitable to participate in those plans?
Yes, in terms of what you have just been explaining to the audience, Andrew, I think the most telling part here in terms of the Rwandan policy is the fact that the UK government has known for a long time, and since well before they instituted this policy, that Rwanda was harassing and intimidating Rwandans in the UK and getting away with doing it. Why on earth, with one of the most repressive governments in that aspect of their international behaviour in the world, why on earth would you want to strike a deal with them? And why on earth would you believe that this deal was going to work in the interests of individuals and was going to ensure that people were properly and reasonably cared for? I mean, the most shocking thing for me is that the UK have known about Rwanda for a long time. They've known about this type of behaviour for a long time, and yet they have gone ahead with this particularly shocking arrangement. And that, for me, is a fundamental point and a reason that I hope opposition to this policy will continue and indeed grow.
Thanks, Roger. I think we'll be reporting on exactly that, increasing opposition and contradiction to Priti Patel's policies over the coming weeks, and I'm sure we'll be discussing it again soon. But let's move on to our next story from the US this time, because a gunman carrying a rifle and a handgun killed 4 people on Wednesday at a medical building on a hospital campus in Tulsa, Oklahoma, police have said, detailing the latest in a series of mass shootings across the US. The number of wounded is not yet known. The Tulsa Police Deputy Chief, Eric Dalgleish, said the gunman also was dead, apparently from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. A police captain, Richard Muhlenberg, said that multiple people were wounded and the medical complex was a catastrophic scene. Police and hospital officials said they were not ready to identify the dead. A spate of gun violence across the US has included the killing of 19 children and 2 teachers at a Texas elementary school, and the killing of 10 people in a racist attack in a supermarket in Buffalo, New York. It has led to Democrats amplifying their calls for greater restrictions on guns, while Republicans emphasize more security at schools. The St. Francis Health System in Tulsa locked down its campus because of the situation at the Natalie Medical Building, which houses an outpatient surgery centre and a breast health centre. Dalgleish said an orthopaedic clinic is located on the 2nd floor, where officers discovered the shooter and several victims. The recent Memorial Day weekend saw multiple mass shootings nationwide, including at a festival in Taft, Oklahoma, only 45 miles from Tulsa. So, Roger, since January this year, there have been 12 shootings where 4 or more people have been killed. That's according to Associated Press. Those shootings have left 76 dead, including 31 adults and children in Buffalo and Texas. The death toll does not include the suspects in each case. So, on average, there are 3 mass shootings a month at the moment, one every 10 days or so. If that carries on, that'll be 36 mass shootings this year. So, do you think is there any red line at which Americans will begin to act to curb these mass shooting events, or has the American population been slowly been a boiling frog for too long, and there won't be any red lines?
I find it very difficult to understand how on earth they've allowed it to get into this situation as it is being faced today. And some of the arguments that are made about what should be done about it, I just find incomprehensible. So that, for example, when I listened to some Republican senators saying, oh, it's all about making sure our schools are more secure. And that's what we need to do, make sure they lock doors and things like that. It's not about guns. Well, of course, That's a completely ridiculous argument. And the two situations, by the way, are not mutually exclusive. It's perfectly possible to make sure people lock the doors and have more secure schools and have gun control. And that surely would contribute something. But you know, you can't shoot anybody if you don't have a gun. And so that if you want to really control the type of violence that is going on in America, day in, day out, it would appear, with gun violence, surely the logic is one of the things you've got to do is control guns. Now, I think most people would see that common sense position as being also a perfectly rational and sensible matter. And, you know, to me, it's just inconceivable that it's got to the situation that it is today.
Absolutely, Roger. And just to bring it back to Scotland for a moment quickly, I was struck by Sir Andy Murray speaking out this week against gun violence and mass killings in schools. On Twitter, he understandably described the shootings in Uvalde in Texas as, in his words, fucking madness. Do you think, Roger? Do you think is Sir Andy Murray right? And is he right? And should we ask him to speak more about these events and what he thinks should be done? Of course, only if he's able to do that.
Yeah, I would be reluctant to ask him to do that because of what his own personal experience has been. You know, I think it's best left to him when he thinks the time is right to say something. You know, I would trust him implicitly to say something that is sensible, as he has done in that case. But I do think he's absolutely right. I won't repeat what he said, but I believe exactly the same as him.
Completely. Thanks, Roger. A point well made. Let's move on to our next story, though, because murders in Scotland are at the lowest level since the creation of Police Scotland in 2013, a new report shows. The Police Scotland Quarter 4 performance report for 2021-22 that was published today shows that ten fewer homicides were recorded than in 2020-21. Fewer attempted murders have also been recorded compared to 2020-21. It also showed an increase in fraud, but a reduction in domestic abuse offences. However, domestic abuse offences are up 3.7% against the 5-year mean calculation. The Deputy Chief Constable, Fiona Taylor, said the figures published today highlight that the past year has been an exceptional time for policing and the effects of the pandemic on crime continue to be felt. She said an overall increase in violent crime is measured against a significant reduction during 2021 due to the restrictions in place at the time. The 5-year mean offers more insight into violent crime. A reduction in the number of homicides is welcome, but there is more to do in order to tackle violence, including working with our partners to prevent offending. She continued, Police Scotland takes domestic abuse very seriously, and we have specialist officers who work in communities across the country to tackle these offences. The comprehensive review we have commissioned into the policing response to public protection will allow us to continue to adapt and respond to shifting demand and vulnerabilities in this space. An increase in fraud has been recorded again this quarter and reaffirms that online policing is increasingly a key part of frontline policing. Work to disrupt the activities of criminals and protect the public has continued, with £6.46 million of fraud being prevented through the banking protocol alone. The Quarter 4 performance report also details findings of Police Scotland's Your Police survey between January and March 2022, with more than 14,000 responses received from members of the public. So, Roger, a couple more features in the overall data. Of the reducing numbers of murders in Scotland, 5% of the murders involved a gun, and we've just been talking about weapons in the US. It's interesting to note that all cases of homicide recorded in Scotland in 2020-21 were solved by Police Scotland, according to the report. But the last piece of data I was going to talk to you about was of the 65 people accused of carrying out these killings, a total of 60 of the 65 were male. Now, I wonder, is that where we should be focusing our efforts? The overwhelming predominance of murders being committed by men in our society?
Yes, and it was ever thus. It has always been the case, so far as I am aware of historical data as well, that males have been responsible for most crimes of violence by a very considerable margin. And worse than that, in some circumstances, such as domestic crime, females tend to be disproportionately the victims. I don't know what the latest figures are, but that certainly has been the situation historically, and I would be surprised if that has not been continuing. I do think society still has a lot to do to protect the rights of women, and I still think society has a lot to do regarding the education of males in our society. And we've a bit to go. One of the things that was reassuring to me about the police statement was they did not say, look at how good we are doing at reducing violent crime. They said specifically, look at the work that we're doing, and we've a lot more work still to do. And I think that is the basic message we all need to take on board. However welcome a drop in homicides may have been in the last period of time, we must redouble our efforts to make sure that the scourge of violence, as far as possible, is eliminated from Scottish society.
Completely, Roger. Thank you. Now, I did promise that we would tie back to an earlier conversation that we had, so time's against us, but we'll do it very briefly if we can. The Deputy Chief Constable said that an increase in fraud has been recorded again this quarter. Now, given that fraud on the public purse seems now to be a fundamental part of the way in which the current Westminster government operates, and its supporters too, should we be surprised that the wider population are starting to increase the amount of fraud that they're indulging in too?
I'm actually writing a paper at the moment precisely on the subject of financial crime. In 2017, throughout the UK, the estimate of the National Crime Agency is that there was £190 billion worth of fraud throughout the UK and rising. And that doesn't include other types of economic crime. And a lot of this crime has been aided and abetted by the lack of effective regulation and controls in UK society and the failure of bodies like HMRC and like Companies House to have proper control over the institutions they should be controlling.
Thank you, Roger. I knew you'd have insight there. I didn't know you were writing a paper, but I'm not at all surprised that you can help us with that. So thank you, Roger, because that was our final item this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station and to make new programmes for you. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. You will also find our appeals for assistance on Facebook and Twitter because the urgent need for financial support has not gone away. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you'd like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland and on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Meantime, we will be here again tomorrow evening with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us then. But that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. Thank you so much to Roger Mullin for his time and contributions this evening, and of course thank you to everyone who's been watching. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Andrew.
I hope that you can join us again soon here on Broadcasting Scotland. Until then, I hope that you enjoy your jubes over the weekend, and we'll play out this evening with a wee video from Hugh Stewart and Greg McCara. Bye-bye.
NEB for Royalty by Jim McLean, updated. 1, 2, 3, 4. The lives a family in the land, the famous royal crewman. They want, they work, they want, they want, they're living on the brew, man. It's NEB for royalty, legal aid for Prince Andy, to pay the cook and clothe the duke, the welfare state's guy handy. Old Jelly's wife is getting on her age, I needn't mention. For every Friday banging time she draws her old age pension. It's NEB for royalty, legal aid for Prince Andy, to pay the cook and clothe the duke, the welfare state's guy handy. When Harry asked her for Meghan's horn, they put her to the test, man. Lizzie ordered thee up your job, be idle like the rest, man. It's NEB for royalty, legal aid for Prince Andy, to pay the cook and clothe the duke, the welfare state's guy handy. Prince Willie's got a brand new car, though he's on the dole, man. To walk free here to the Labour Exchange, he says he can't thole, man. It's NEB for royalty, legal aid for Prince Andy, to pay the cook and clothe the duke, the welfare state's guy handy. Queen Lizzie's visited many's a land and gazed on many a sick man. I bet you $5 she ne'er has seen a pie on a Friday next, man. It's NEB for royalty, legal aid for Prince Andy, to pay the cook and clothe the duke, the welfare state's guy handy. NEB for royalty.
Thanks, Will.